On January 16, 2026, during an unrelated White House event on rural health care, President Donald Trump stopped mid-conversation and delivered a threat that sent ripples through European capitals. He said he may impose tariffs on any country that refuses to support the United States taking control of Greenland. His exact words: "I may put a tariff on countries if they don't go along with Greenland, because we need Greenland for national security." That was not a passing comment. That was not an offhand remark. It was the first time an American president has openly suggested weaponizing trade policy to force allied nations to accept the absorption of another NATO member's territory. Denmark, the country that controls Greenland, is a founding member of NATO. So is every major European nation now watching to see what happens next. And for a brief but noticeable period after the threat was made, immediate responses from European leaders were limited. That silence said something. The tariff threat came just one day after Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen and Greenland's Foreign Minister Vivian Motzfeldt met with Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Washington. That meeting did not resolve the fundamental disagreement over the future of Greenland. The Danish delegation returned home with nothing settled. Hours later, Trump escalated, and the European Union, despite weeks of tough statements, did not immediately fire back. In media narratives, this hesitation was noted. In diplomatic circles, it raised questions. In Washington, it may have been seen as an opening. Let's be clear about what just happened. This is not a trade dispute. This is not a routine tariff threat. This is the President of the United States openly suggesting economic punishment for any nation that stands in the way of Washington absorbing sovereign territory belonging to a NATO ally. And when you understand what that means for the alliance, for international law, for the balance of power in the Arctic, you understand why European capitals are struggling to respond. Greenland is not just an island. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, which gives its roughly 57,000 residents significant self-governance while Denmark handles defense and foreign affairs. It hosts Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base, which the United States has operated since 1951 under a defense agreement with Denmark. That base is critical for missile early warning systems, satellite tracking, and monitoring Arctic military activity. Greenland's location in the Guyuk Gap, the stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, makes it one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. It is where submarines from Russia's Northern Fleet must pass to reach the Atlantic, and it sits atop vast reserves of rare earth minerals essential for modern technology and green energy. The island's mineral wealth is staggering. Estimates place the value of untapped resources, including rare earth elements critical for electronics, electric vehicles, and defense systems, in the trillions of dollars. Climate change is making these resources increasingly accessible as ice melts and new mining opportunities emerge. Greenland also straddles emerging Arctic shipping routes that could reshape global trade as polar ice continues to recede. Whoever controls Greenland controls a critical choke point in the new geopolitical order taking shape as the climate shifts. Trump has framed his interest in Greenland as a national security imperative. He has repeatedly claimed that Russia and China have ships and submarines operating near the island, but experts and military officials have consistently disputed this. Major General Søren Andersen, the head of Denmark's Joint Arctic Command, told CNN just hours before Trump's tariff comments that there's no immediate threat to Greenland. He said he had seen no Chinese or Russian military ships in the area since taking command. His job is to know. He operates there. He monitors the waters daily. So either he is wrong or the justification being used to pressure Europe is not what it appears to be. Here's where it matters. Trump is not simply asking for a bigger American footprint in Greenland. He is not negotiating for expanded base rights or deeper security cooperation. He has said anything less than U.S. control is unacceptable. He has refused to rule out the use of military force. His administration has discussed making an offer to purchase the island, which Denmark and Greenland have already rejected, emphatically. And now he is threatening tariffs on nations that don't cooperate. That is coercion, plain and simple. And when the target is a NATO ally, when the underlying message is that borders can be redrawn by the strong, that becomes a precedent. It is the exact kind of precedent that European leaders have spent years warning about in other contexts. Russia in Ukraine, China in the South China Sea. The Western alliance has built its entire post-war legitimacy on the idea that territorial integrity is non-negotiable, that borders cannot be changed by force, that sovereignty means something. And now, one of its founding members is threatening to violate those very principles. To understand why the European response has been so measured, why some have described it as cautious to the point of silence, you have to understand what is at stake for them. Europe relies on NATO. Without it, there is no credible collective defense against Russia. The continent has spent decades building its security infrastructure around American military commitments. Germany hosts tens of thousands of U.S. forces. Poland depends on American deterrence on its eastern flank. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, would be vulnerable without the American security umbrella. If that alliance fractures over Greenland, the entire architecture of European defense comes into question, and the moment Europe pushes back too hard, they risk Trump accelerating the break. That is the trap. Respond too weakly, and it looks like capitulation. It suggests that the United States can pressure allies into submission without consequence. Respond too forcefully, and you might trigger exactly the rupture you are trying to avoid. You might give Trump the pretext to say that Europe is ungrateful, that the alliance is worthless, that America should withdraw. This is the dilemma that has left some European capitals calculating their next move very carefully. They are not silent out of agreement. They are silent out of fear of what comes next. Consider the context. Just weeks earlier, the United States launched a military strike in Venezuela that removed President Nicolas Maduro. Whatever you think of Maduro, that action demonstrated that the current American administration is willing to use force when it believes its interests are at stake. European leaders watched that happen. They noted the absence of international consequences, and now they are hearing the same president talk about Greenland in ways that echo the rhetoric used before previous interventions. That creates a chilling effect. It is important to note, EU leaders have not been entirely silent. In the weeks leading up to the January 16th tariff threat, a joint statement was issued by leaders from Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom. They declared that Greenland belongs to its people, and that only Denmark and Greenland can decide their future. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, the same leader who dismissed Trump's 2019 proposal to buy Greenland as absurd, warned that a U.S. attack on Greenland would end NATO. She was not exaggerating. An attack on a NATO member by another NATO member would be the end of the alliance as we know it. There is no mechanism to handle that scenario. The alliance was designed to protect members from external threats, not from each other. French President Emmanuel Macron said any violation of an ally's sovereignty would have unprecedented knock-on effects. He visited Nuuk, Greenland's capital, in the weeks before the tariff threat. France announced it would open a consulate there. These are not the actions of a continent that is acquiescing, but they are also not the actions of a continent that believes the threat has passed. European troops began arriving in Greenland on January 15th under an operation called Arctic Endurance. France deployed mountain infantry. Germany sent a reconnaissance team of 13 personnel. Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom all contributed forces. The official framing was that this was a routine NATO exercise designed to test Arctic capabilities and deter Russian activity on NATO's northern flank. But everyone understood the real message. Europe was showing up. Europe was watching. And Europe wanted Washington to know that Greenland was not undefended. So there have been words. There have been symbolic deployments. There have been consulates announced and flags planted. But what was noticeably absent in the immediate hours after Trump made his tariff threat on January 16th was a coordinated, forceful rebuttal. The January 6th statement came before the tariff float. The military deployments were already in motion. What happened after the threat was a pause, a deliberate silence, while governments assessed whether this was a negotiating tactic, a genuine escalation, or something in between. Some officials in Europe privately described it as strategic restraint. Better to wait and see than to overreact. Others saw it as hesitation, as indecision, as weakness. And on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, the perception of delay fueled criticism. Some commentators argued the EU was being too slow to respond. Others accused European leaders of being paralyzed by their dependence on the United States. Satirical posts circulated showing NATO requesting American help to defend against America. The irony was not lost on anyone. The truth is somewhere in between. What Europe is doing is not nothing, but it is not enough to change the momentum of what Trump is doing either. Let's talk about what Greenland itself has said, because the people who live there have been remarkably clear, and in many ways, their voice is the one that matters most. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen, a 34-year-old former badminton champion who became the youngest leader in Greenlandic history after winning nearly 30% of the vote in the March 2025 elections, has not wavered. He leads a broad coalition government through his center-right Democratic Party. His background combines athletic discipline with political pragmatism, and he has been consistent in his rejection of American pressure. On January 13th, at a joint press conference with Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen in Copenhagen, Nielsen said, "If we have to choose between the United States and Denmark here and now, we choose Denmark. We choose NATO. We choose the Kingdom of Denmark. We choose the EU." That was his answer, clear and unambiguous. He was not hedging. He was not leaving the door open. He was telling the United States that Greenland had made its choice, and that choice was not Washington. He was not done. He added that Greenland will not be owned by the United States, governed by the United States, or part of the United States. He described the current situation as a geopolitical crisis. He called Trump's ambitions a fantasy, and he said he would continue to seek dialogue because that is what responsible leaders do, but that the fundamental answer would not change. A few days earlier, all 5 political parties in Greenland's parliament issued a joint statement. Political divisions were set aside, left and right came together, and they spoke with one voice. "We do not want to be Americans," they wrote. "We do not want to be Danes. We want to be Greenlanders. We must decide our country's future ourselves." That last line matters, because Greenland has, for decades, been on a slow path toward greater autonomy and possibly independence. The island exited the European Economic Community in 1985 over fishing rights, the only territory ever to leave what would become the European Union. It gained expanded self-rule in 2009, taking control of its judicial system, police, and natural resources, while Denmark retained responsibility for defense and foreign policy. Its leaders have discussed independence as a long-term aspiration, though the economic challenges remain significant. Greenland depends heavily on Danish subsidies and is still developing the economic base that would make full independence viable. But none of that translates into a desire to be absorbed by the United States. In fact, public sentiment in Greenland appears overwhelmingly opposed to Trump's approach. Residents have described feeling like they are being treated as a strategic resource rather than as human beings with rights and agency. They have watched as their homeland became the subject of international headlines, as politicians in Washington debated their fate without consulting them, as the most powerful country in the world talked about them as if they were property to be acquired. Sarah Olsvig, the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which represents approximately 180,000 Inuit across Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia's Chukotka region, put it bluntly. "The persistent messaging from the White House," she said, "offers a clear picture of how the U.S. administration views indigenous peoples and peoples that are few in numbers. She told the Associated Press in Nuuk that the issue is how one of the biggest powers in the world views other peoples that are less powerful than them. Aja Chemnitz Larsen, a Greenlandic politician and member of the Danish parliament, met with the bipartisan U.S. congressional delegation that visited Copenhagen on January 16th. She told reporters afterward, "We have heard so many lies, to be honest, and so much exaggeration on the threats towards Greenland." She said the biggest threat Greenlanders see right now is not from Russia or China. It is from Washington. So where does that leave Europe? As of January 17, 2026, several responses are now underway, though their scope remains limited and their ultimate effectiveness remains uncertain. First, military presence. Denmark announced an expansion of its military forces in Greenland, including aircraft, ships, and personnel rotations. Defense Minister Troels Lund Poulsen said the country would maintain a more permanent military presence throughout 2026. Multiple NATO countries joined Denmark's effort. France deployed mountain infantry to Nuuk and announced additional land, air, and maritime assets would follow. Germany sent a 13-member reconnaissance team to examine defense capabilities. Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom all contributed personnel for what has been called Operation Arctic Endurance. These deployments are small. We are talking about dozens of troops, not thousands. They are not combat-ready forces designed to repel an invasion. They are symbols. They are tripwires. Their purpose is to raise the political cost of any American action by ensuring that European soldiers would be in harm's way. It is the same logic that has kept U.S. forces in South Korea and Germany for decades, not because a few thousand troops could stop a full-scale invasion, but because their presence ensures that any attack would immediately involve the ally. The Danish Joint Arctic Command has invited the United States to participate in Arctic endurance exercises. Major General Soren Andersen, the commander, emphasized that the mission is focused on deterring Russia and protecting NATO's northern flank. He described the scenario of NATO allies attacking each other as hypothetical and said he does not envision it happening. But the fact that it has to be discussed at all tells you something about where we are. Second, diplomatic signaling. France announced it would open a new consulate in Nuuk on February 6th. Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot called it a political signal. Canada said it would do the same. These are modest moves. Consulates are not military bases, but they send a message. Greenland matters to more than just Denmark and the United States, and other nations are watching closely. Third, economic contingency planning. The European Parliament is reportedly considering freezing a July 2025 tariff agreement with the United States until the pressure on Greenland ceases. Some officials have discussed broader countermeasures, including the EU's anti-coercion instrument, which was designed specifically to respond to economic bullying by foreign powers. There has even been talk, mostly speculative at this stage, of potential sanctions on U.S. technology firms, restrictions on American access to European military bases, or trade disruptions that could affect the more than $600 billion in annual transatlantic commerce. These remain hypothetical. No European government has pulled the trigger on serious economic retaliation. But the fact that these options are being discussed, that European officials are openly floating scenarios like evicting American forces from continental bases, tells you how seriously the threat is being taken behind closed doors. Fourth, alliance reinforcement. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has pledged continued cooperation with the United States on Arctic security, while stating that the EU will double down on investments in Greenland. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas described Trump's messages as extremely concerning and said internal discussions were ongoing. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz signed onto the joint declaration affirming Greenland's sovereignty. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius described the situation as a power play and said Germany was in discussions with Copenhagen about options. But none of this has directly addressed the tariff threat itself. That remains the unanswered question. Here is the part that no one in Europe wants to say out loud. Trump holds leverage. The transatlantic trade relationship is massive. American troops are stationed across Europe. U.S. military support has been essential to Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression, and the broader NATO structure depends on American commitment, not just on paper but in practice. If Europe escalates too quickly, it risks accelerating exactly the kind of alliance breakdown that would benefit Russia. That is the paradox sitting at the heart of this crisis. Standing up too forcefully against American coercion could weaken the very framework that protects Europe from other forms of coercion. European officials have privately described their approach as a strategy of engagement with deterrence. They want to maintain dialogue, signal resolve through limited military presence, and avoid a full confrontation while hoping that internal U.S. politics, Congress, courts, public opinion will constrain Trump's actions. They are betting that the system will hold. There is some evidence to support that bet. A CNN poll released in January 2026 found that only 25% of Americans support Trump's Greenland ambitions. That means 3/4 of the American public does not think this is a good idea. A bipartisan delegation of U.S. lawmakers traveled to Copenhagen on the same day as the tariff threat to reassure Denmark and Greenland that Congress does not support any effort to forcibly take the island. Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska who has deep familiarity with Arctic issues, told Danish lawmakers that when Americans are asked whether they think it is a good idea for the United States to acquire Greenland, some 75% will say, "We do not think that is a good idea." Senator Chris Coons, the Democratic delegation leader, said the trip was meant to lower the temperature and demonstrate that there is no consensus in Washington for coercion. He thanked Denmark for 225 years of being a good and trusted ally and partner, and emphasized that Congress wants to nurture that relationship into the future. But Congress does not control tariff policy. The president has broad authority to impose tariffs, and Trump has shown he is willing to push ahead regardless of legislative opposition or international criticism. There is another dimension to all of this: the legal question. Trump has used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose sweeping tariffs throughout his administration. That law was designed for genuine national emergencies, not routine trade negotiations or foreign policy leverage. Multiple courts have found his use of it unlawful. The dispute is now before the U.S. Supreme Court, which is expected to rule soon on whether the president has the authority to impose broad, country-specific tariffs under this statute. The justices heard arguments in early November. Both conservative and liberal-leaning justices asked skeptical questions about the method by which Trump has imposed his most sweeping duties. Trump has publicly expressed concern about the outcome. He has said that his entire tariff agenda could unravel if the court rules against him. That ruling could change the calculus significantly. If the Supreme Court limits his tariff powers, the Greenland threat may lose its teeth. If the court upholds them or finds a way to preserve most of his authority, it will embolden further action. On the international side, a U.S. military move against Greenland would almost certainly violate the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. It could invoke NATO's Article 5, which treats an attack on one member as an attack on all, though applying it to a situation where the attacker is also a member would be unprecedented and deeply destabilizing. The alliance has no mechanism for this. It was never designed to handle it. The very idea breaks the foundational logic of collective defense. Analysts have noted that there are U.S. statutory restrictions on withdrawing from NATO without congressional approval, and that any military operation against a NATO ally without congressional authorization could violate the War Powers Resolution. These are significant legal barriers, but they are also untested in a scenario like this. No president has ever tried to seize territory from a NATO ally. The system has not been stress-tested in this way. In other words, the path from threat to action is not straightforward, but threats can still cause damage. They shift expectations. They erode trust. They change the way allies plan and prepare. They set precedents that can be invoked later. And once the idea is normalized that territory can be taken from allies through pressure, the entire architecture of the Western alliance begins to crumble. So what happens next? The working group agreed to, after the Vance-Rubio meeting with Danish and Greenlandic officials, is supposed to continue discussions. But Denmark has made clear that the fundamental disagreement remains unresolved. Greenland has made clear that it does not want to be American. Europe has made clear that it views the situation as extremely concerning, and Trump has made clear that he intends to acquire Greenland one way or another. The European troop deployments in Greenland will continue throughout 2026. They are small, symbolic, not combat-ready, but they are meant to serve as a tripwire. Their presence raises the political cost of any American action. It signals that Europe is paying attention. It puts American planners in the uncomfortable position of having to account for the possibility, however remote, that military escalation could mean confrontation with allies. The Supreme Court ruling could come at any time. If it limits Trump's tariff authority, the threat of trade punishment weakens. If it upholds it, the next question becomes, will Trump actually follow through? And if he does, how will Europe respond? Economic retaliation is possible. Trade disruptions could be catastrophic for both sides. But European leaders may calculate that absorbing short-term pain is preferable to accepting a precedent that undermines the entire international order. The deeper question, the one that will outlast this particular crisis, is whether this moment accelerates Europe's push for strategic autonomy. That is the idea that the continent needs to be capable of defending itself without relying on the United States. That discussion has been ongoing for years, accelerated by previous moments of transatlantic tension and by the recognition that American priorities are shifting toward the Pacific. Events like this sharpen that debate. If the American president is willing to threaten tariffs to force allies into surrendering territory, what exactly does the alliance protect? What is the point of NATO if one of its members can pressure another without consequence? Some in Europe have already begun to draw conclusions. Analysts at think tanks like the European Council on Foreign Relations have called for an explicit European Arctic coalition, for sustained investments in Greenland's infrastructure and security, for a posture that makes coercion unassailable. Others have argued that Europe should impose costs now, freeze trade agreements, restrict base access, make clear that there are consequences for this kind of behavior. But those steps require unity, and European unity is always harder than it looks. Different countries have different relationships with the United States, different dependencies, different vulnerabilities. What is an acceptable risk for France may be unthinkable for Poland. What Germany can absorb economically, smaller nations cannot. There is one more thing worth noting. It is the uncomfortable irony at the heart of this entire crisis. Critics of Trump's Greenland push, including analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations and the European Council on Foreign Relations, have pointed out a troubling dynamic. Trump's stated rationale, that Greenland must be controlled to counter Russia, may actually benefit Russia. By creating divisions within NATO, by forcing Europe to choose between alliance cohesion and sovereignty, by making the United States look like a coercive power rather than a protective one, the Greenland Gambit does exactly what Moscow has long sought to do: fracture the West. A European government official told Politico that accepting the narrative of Russian and Chinese threats to justify annexation plays into Russian hands. It legitimizes the idea that powerful states can redraw borders under the guise of security. It sets a precedent that could be invoked elsewhere, by Russia, by China, by anyone with territorial ambitions and the power to pursue them. And it distracts from the actual ongoing threat that Russia poses in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe. Whether Trump intends this outcome is unclear. Whether it matters is another question entirely. What matters is the effect. And the effect, right now, is a NATO alliance under strain, a European response that is cautious to the point of seeming hesitant, and a U.S. president who appears willing to test how far he can push. This is not over. It is not close to over. The tariff threat has been made. The diplomatic meetings have produced no resolution. The troop deployments continue. The Supreme Court case looms. And in Greenland, 57,000 people are watching as the most powerful country in the world debates whether to treat them as citizens of an ally or assets to be acquired. European leaders will eventually have to respond more forcefully. If they do not, the perception of silence will harden into a perception of weakness. And if that happens, the next demand will be harder to resist. That is how coercion works. It starts with a threat. It continues with a pause. It watches for hesitation. And it ends when someone decides that the cost of resisting is greater than the cost of complying. The question now is whether that point has been reached, or whether Europe, Greenland, Denmark, and the broader international community will draw a line that cannot be crossed without consequence. A line that says, this far and no further. A line backed not just by statements, but by actions that impose real costs. As of January 17, 2026, that line has not been clearly drawn. The statements have been made. The troops have arrived. But the tariff threat remains unanswered. The fundamental disagreement remains unresolved. And the silence, that brief, noticeable silence after the threat was made, continues to echo. What comes next will determine not just the future of Greenland, but the future of the Western Alliance itself, whether it can withstand pressure from within, whether its principles mean anything when tested by one of its own, whether sovereignty is a right or just a word. Those are the questions on the table now, and they do not have easy answers.